when we are talking about the multidimensional poverty index. So what is that? What are those? How is the index calculated, and what are the terminologies that I use? That's something that we're going to talk about. And finally, I think one of the most important bits of the session is that we've got one entire part of the session, the third part of the session. We're going to sit together and we're going to brainstorm after we've understood the concept on how can headerize various functions within the organization use the multidimensional poverty index and the concepts and the techniques that we've done. So we've divided this session roughly into 3 segments. The time is roughly about 10 minutes or so. We can play around with that. It's quite flexible. So the first is what is multidimensional poverty? So the concept that is mainly a theoretical and a conceptual understanding. The second and third sessions are a lot more practical. So the second session we're going to be talking about how is the MPI calculated, and we're going to actually be doing this activity where you're going to calculate the MPI for 5 fictional districts. So we'll be breaking up into groups and together calculating. As we're learning the methodology, we'll also be calculating what the MPI is. And sorry, yeah. And the third session is the brainstorming session on how the MPI can be used. So we'll have a small introduction by this, but the rest of it is all going to be in your hands. We're going to try to see exactly how the MPI can be used. So before we start, there's a small activity that we generally start all these sessions with, because it's one thing for me to sort of be droning on over here, but it's a lot more helpful if I understand from the participants what their idea of the subject matter is, and then sort of cater to that understanding, use that as a starting point to do it. So I want you to take a minute to just think about what poverty means to you. Then we're going to and then we're going to give you each one poster. You're going to write down in one line what poverty means to you. So one example is my understanding of poverty, for example, could be poverty is the inability to eat 3 square meals a day. So something very, very simple. I want you to just condense that concept into one line, and then I want you to come here and put it up on the whiteboard.
all about feeling poor. That's poverty.
So there's some pretty interesting inputs over here, and I think from the, if one would have just to look at this, there's everything ranging from food, from basic needs. So there's everything ranging from the meeting basic necessities of day-to-day life. We're talking about food, we're talking about shelter, we're talking about agency, capability, we're talking about happiness. So we're talking about a bunch of different things over here. So I think generally when we look at a definition historically of what poverty is, then we usually tend to talk about it from an income or from a financial resources point of view, because that's just been the traditional sort of thought. The moment we think of poor, we think of not having enough financial resources. But I think there has been a shift in the definitions, and generally when we're even talking about it, whether we talk to the poor or whether we talk to people working with the poor or whether we talk to the average person, along with the financial resources, we generally miss out. I mean, there's a big focus on the lack of financial resources, but we also miss out on the to do what part, right? So it's usually lack of financial resources for food, for clothing, for education, for meeting the basic necessities of life, and I think that's where the important bit is, and that's where the concept of multidimensional poverty comes in. So without sort of taking any more time, let's go into the first part of the session, which is on multidimensional poverty. So before we start the session, let me give you a little bit of an introduction to myself and why I'm doing this session. So my name is Anil. I run a development consulting firm called Pragma Development Advisors. We're based in Malaysia and in Bangalore. So we basically work with non-profits. We work with social enterprises. That's our primary client group, and sometimes a little bit with the government. But our main aim is to help social enterprises and non-profits increase their development outcomes, and we do that through two distinct service lines that we offer. The first being research services, and the second being policy advocacy and policy analysis services. So we've been working with HeadHeldi, I think, on and off since 2018 or so, when we first did this mapping of social security schemes. And since then, there's been some little bits of work, some little bit of research and writing that we've been doing so far. And this was something that Pankaj asked us to do when, in fact, the discussion actually came out of that. We were talking about one of the programs and doing some research for, I think, one of your programs in Raichur, I think. And I think as a result of that, we decided, okay, why not, try to think about what we can do over here also. So my background is in public policy. So poverty alleviation is one of the things that we study as like a core subject within public policy, and it's a 6-month course. So I'm going to try and cram whatever I can about multidimensional poverty within 3 hours, and that's why I've tried to make it a lot more activity based, because it's a lot more useful to understand. Since you're all coming from a practical and not a theoretical or an academic viewpoint, it's a lot more important to understand exactly what we're working with, rather than sort of understanding, say the definitions of concepts and things like that. So that's why we made it more practical, so that it's more oriented towards your use. So before we go into multidimensional poverty, what is unidimensional poverty, right? What is the dimension that we're talking about here? So this is the Ministry of Rural Development. This is the definition that they've given for poverty in a paper from 2020. This is very recent. This was a paper on poverty measurement, and this is the definition that they give. So poverty can be defined as a condition in which an individual or a household lacks the financial resources to afford a basic minimum standard of living. Now, if you look at the terminology between this, or the phrasing of this and the phrasing of a lot of what all of you have written, you'll start to see a lot of similarities, in the way that poverty is structured, or the idea of poverty is structured. So it's always structured as 1, a condition or a situation. 2, it is about an individual or a household. 3, you're usually talking about the lack of resources in some form, either financial, monetary, or livelihood resources, to afford a basic minimum standard of living. So there's always this common phrasing that you'll see, and if you read all of the definitions, when we take a break, I want you to just come together and just have a look at the different things that everyone has written, and you'll see that the phraseology that's used is very, very similar. Now, I think the key over here when we're talking about what is the dimension that, when we say multidimensional or when we say unidimensional, what is the dimension that is coming through here? It's very simple. It is the lack of financial resources, that is income or money or the ability to take on expenditure. So for the longest time, I think from the time that poverty has been calculated, India has the longest year calculating poverty. We've been doing it since the 1930s, I think. So traditionally, the tool that's been used all over the world has been to track income, and because income is slightly hard to calculate, especially when you go to the poorer sections of society, it's very hard to track income sources because there's no clear sort of ITR and all of this stuff that puts very solid numbers on the table. So instead, what we usually use as a proxy is to look at consumption expenditure. So we generally look at what do poor households spend money on, and that's usually done through the national sample surveys that we have. And that's used as a proxy to look at what is their income level. So, but I think what stands out is the fact that across the world, whenever we've spoken about poverty, the focus has always been on financial resources. There's nothing wrong with that, but whether it's complete or not is something that we're going to debate when we go further. So, what is the approach that's used? So, you would have all heard about when we're talking about poverty, we talk about something called the poverty rate and the poverty line. So, how is that calculated? What is the measure that's used over there? What is the poverty line? So, there are 3 steps that we use to calculate unidimensional poverty or income-based poverty. The first is to define what is called the poverty line basket. So, the poverty line basket is nothing but a set of commodities that is predefined, which is used as a measure to understand that this is what you need to meet the basic necessities of life. So it could contain food, it could contain clothing, it could contain education, expenditure on health and so on. So this poverty line basket is basically the first thing that's calculated. So from the 1930s till now, there has been a lot of changes in how that methodology of that poverty line basket is used. So initially it was the government had taken a solid stance. So when Dadabhai Naoroji was on the poverty line calculation panel, and at that point they had said that provision of health and education is something that is the state's responsibility. So when we're calculating the poverty line, we're not going to take expenditure on those 2 elements because it's the state's responsibility to provide that service at a subsidized or a free rate. So they have said that what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the poverty line basket purely based on the expenditure on food items. And for that food items, they had set a calorie-based measure, saying that for a household of 5, we need this many calories. It's going to come from these many food sources, and this is the expenditure that is mean expenditure across India on these essential food items. After that, that's gone through a lot of change from the 60s, 70s, 80s. Every 10 years, there's been a change on exactly what constitutes that poverty line basket. So the first change that happened was they split it up into urban and rural, because they were like, the cost of commodities is very different when you come to an urban setting versus a rural setting. So as urbanization started increasing, they started changing the poverty line rates for urban and rural areas. Then they started including even non-food items within this. So the non-food items that was first included was clothing, because they said that access to clothing is a basic necessity, and it's not just food that is included. So they widened that basket over time. They split it up into urban and rural, and then that urban and rural was again mashed into one poverty line basket back in the 2000s. And it's gone through change. And then the most crucial change that they did, however, was if you looked at it from the 30s to the 60s, there was always this sort of top-down approach to poverty measurement, in the sense that the government sort of decided, or the poverty estimation panel always decided, this is the basket. This is what the poor should be spending on. But that did not always reflect the way that the poor actually, spend their money. So there was always a change between what the government thought they should spend on and what the poor actually spent on, because it's very hard to sort of arrive at one sort of normative understanding of, this is what your livelihood expenditure or your basic expenditure should be. So there was a lot of studies done in the 70s and 80s. There were a host of committees. There was the the Lakadawala committee, and there was a whole bunch of 3 or 4 different committees that suggested that we move from this idea of trying to assign one poverty line basket, saying that this is the basic expenditure that should be met, and instead arriving at the basket based purely on what the poor actually spend on. So a series of studies so it's a bottom-up approach where a series of studies inform what the poor spend on, and then set the bar according to that. That's a pattern that we followed so far. So there are periodic studies done along with the NSSO studies which inform poverty measurement, which tell you exactly what the poor spend on, and then the poverty line basket is defined based on that. So once the poverty line basket is set, the poverty line is nothing but the expenditure that would be required to buy the commodities or buy the essentials that are given in the poverty line basket. And then it's a simple matter of plotting the incomes of various households. And again, like I said, income is not usually the one that's used. Consumption expenditure is used as proxy. And once that is done, there are two broad measures that are used in unidimensional poverty. The first is something called head count ratio. The first is actually just the head count. The head count is nothing but the absolute number of people who are below the poverty line. So that gives you the spread of poverty, right? How many people are poor? The head count ratio is something that was developed after that, which is the ratio of the poor to the non-poor. So it is nothing but the number of poor upon the total number of people in the population. So that gives you an idea of the spread of poverty. How many people are poor in the total population? Because if you just look at, and this is a perennial debate, we'll go into the ethical and the philosophical questions, but a perennial debate that has been coming up between the right and the left is, what is it that we should measure? Should we look at the absolute number of poverty? So the right says, look at the absolute number of people in poverty, and just pull those people out of poverty. It doesn't matter what is the proportion of people who are poor to non-poor, whereas the left says, no, you have to look at that as a measure of welfare or well-being within the society. So that's something that we'll come into, and at any point if you have any questions, please do so. With the
definition of poverty.
Yeah. Okay. So the one that I put up earlier, this one? Yeah.
See, basically for me something like, for me my understanding also, this last bit to me is the social service sector that owns this things. See, this is man-made like a creation. It's not something like, I don't have a choice. But what has happened is happened. Maybe poor, it may be like whatever it is. But if a person something like the man-made creation, if you look at Darwin's theory of evolution, everybody is same. Correct? Based on our caste, religion and all these things, they made it their own way. It's like man-made creation. It's not something like poverty is not there. It's a state of point. That's all. Where the choice for me something like, where the choice something like, but this happened. Maybe poor people. I cannot say that's a poor family. I don't have choice in this world, right? So look at Darwin's theory of evolution. How is something like everybody is same? Based on our creation, I think based on our whatever you want to give definition of all these things, that people something like that, they want to show this powerful and powerless. They believe the sectors like religion, caste and all these things, and today also like something huge difference. Based on this poverty, that one word, that people are making money out of this.
So I think there is a fundamental sort of within social sectors or social science, we usually talk about something called a social construct. So you're right, poverty is a social construct in the sense that there isn't a biological definition of what is poverty and what is
financial, something like what financial and all this thing. Even something like I cannot say something like he is a poor guy. I cannot going a family something like okay, family entering is slum. I cannot say something like this community something like poor. It's man-made creation.
It's a man-made creation, but that's also that's the importance of when you live in a society, I think the importance of the social construct is that a social construct becomes as important as a biological construct because that defines every element of your being.
Like so the same way that in the government sector also, all the programs, everything, it is going to segregate everyone actually. The program is something like common man. Yes, we are all human beings. Let's play for that and let's say nobody's playing. All programs are coming to something like big, something like richer becomes richer and poorer becomes poorer. Whatever it is, we are giving global. Today also, look at something like water. Water is something like something like belongs to everyone. But who's exploiting not actually water? It's a natural resource. If you look at something like water, if you take water, the poor something like paying is not getting any whatever he wants actually. But at the same time, actually, the natural resource belongs to everyone.
Right, and that's exactly what we're trying to rectify. So when we calculate something like multidimensional poverty, the idea is that we're able to rectify some of this and we're achieving equitable distribution. But for that, I think the first step is to understand that it is no longer a social construct in just the mind. A social construct is as real as a biological construct. So if you look at money, for example, you look at like the physical representation of that piece of paper, right? It's nothing but a piece of paper. It only has meaning because we've all said that it has meaning, right? Otherwise, if I just pick up like a piece of paper right now, tear out a piece of paper from my notebook and just wrote 100 rupees on it and gave it to someone, they're not going to believe it. The reason that money has value is because all of us have agreed collectively that this has value. So that those words that are there, right? I promise to pay the bearer a sum of rupees so and so. We've chosen to give that value, and that's why it exists. So social realities or social constructs are as real as biological realities now. So it isn't enough for us to say that it is a man-made creation. Yes, it is a man-made creation. There is no doubt about it. But just as these man-made creations, just like biological realities, these man-made creations are also affecting quality of life and well-being of people. And that's why this definition, when you look at it, it's termed as generically as it's termed, which is that it is about the financial resource, it is about the social construct, it is about how society divides resources. So when we're talking about something like water, achieving equitable distribution may not be happening right now. But when we are able to measure, giving terms like, or using terms like the poverty line or multidimensional poverty, or even the Gini coefficient and inequality, the reason that we have all of these measures is to understand those social constructs. So the same way that we can look at, say, something biological like sex and say, okay, this person is male or this person is female, versus something like what is coming up now, right? Gender fluidity and that kind of concept, which is a social construct. So I think over there, that's where this helps us to visualize what are those social realities and then look at how we can achieve equitable distribution in the context of those social realities.
No, I understand that, but at the same time, actually, if you already something like images created in mind, if you look at something like generation is something like now, they already created the image actually. Or these are the things something like if you look at the financial, social, and all this, the demand of what we're looking at, that image is coming the way people are going to identify that something creating a brand, or these people are poor.
Yeah, that's actually what multidimensional poverty changes. So when we go into a little bit more of detail about it, you'll start to see that idea of what is poor and what is non-poor is changing using this concept of multidimensional poverty. So the older poverty line approach has been deemed to be incomplete. It's not invaluable. It's incomplete in how is it measuring poverty. So multidimensional poverty gives us a much better, because you'll see when we go into the case studies, you'll see that a lot of the data says that people who come from income poor backgrounds are not necessarily the ones who are deprived. You're actually seeing a lot of people who are in non-income poor households who are also deprived. So that's what the idea of multidimensional poverty is going to sort of address to some degree. So when we go into that session, maybe if you still have some questions about it, we can probably talk again at that point. So this is so we're no, it's very similar. So when we're talking about unidimensional poverty or the definition of poverty that is created so far in the globe, this is generally the one that will come up. It will be a slight modification of this. It might not say financial resources, it could say just resources. It could talk about basic minimum standards of living could be phased differently, but the fundamental components of the definition are always similar until you look at something like the capability approach, which is when we talk about people like Amartya Sen or John Grace and the way that they define poverty, it's very different. We'll come to that. It's there in subsequent slides.
Each and every person something like they have their own inbuilt entrepreneurial skills. They don't like participate people are all something like it's created by human beings based on their survival.
Yeah, which is the same thing as anything that we live in. I think now it's time to sort of acknowledge the fact that everything that we live in is a social reality. So the fact that we're wearing clothes, for example, is also a social construct. Nobody, when we're born, we're not born with clothes, right? So we sort of deemed that this is the way to appear. So today, if I came in, in formal attire and not say jeans and t-shirt, it will be sort of socially agreed that this is the way that we will sort of live. So we can't anymore distance ourselves from the fact that there is a social reality. But now we need to understand how that social reality manifests itself and what can we do to achieve that equitable distribution that we're talking about. So this is one of the measures that helps us to do that and helps us to visualize that better.
Adding to this evaluation from 1930s, it has not happened overnight. When it started, it was unidimensional. Now it is multidimensional. And also, all the progress countries will have a huge imbalance between the poor and the rich. The more they progress, there will be more imbalance. During COVID, about all the rich people have increased their wealth by 4 times, 5 times in 2 years. Right? This is the imbalance. That's why the policies and the distribution which talks about balancing them out. How do we take out money from there and pass it to the people who are living? India is about what, 22% of poverty. 21% of poverty. So how do we distribute equally something? The multi-dimensional poverty that talks about that focuses on.
Right. And the definition of poverty also changes.
Like whatever it is, something like what is the question is for me, something like still, whatever the government schemes that they are making, whatever equal distribution, they made something like image like poverty. I don't want to make them rank. They have rights. They have rights to ask. No something like, I'm supporting poverty. I'm supporting that they have rights to live in this world. They have rights to do whatever they want. Whatever they have access, they will have access to that.
Right.
But no need something like I'm supporting for poverty.
Right. So I think that's a more fundamental philosophical question about how do we treat people with poverty, people in poverty, right? So do we look at them as disenfranchised, unempowered, or sort of all of these more negative ideas?
It's like using power and powerless.
Yeah. So that's a slightly more fundamental debate that we need to have. So that's more about how we view them and how we treat them. So do we adopt like a paternalistic output and say that okay, these people are not capable of living their own lives, so we have to provide them with support? Or do we look at a way in which, like a capability approach which says that everyone has a certain inherent capability or functioning or an ability to achieve functioning, and our job is to increase that or maximize that? So I think that's a slightly more fundamental debate. If we get into that, it's a much longer debate to be had. So maybe if we have time in the end, that's something that we can address at that point. So when we look at, so coming back to the headcount ratio, so I was talking about the different measures that are there, right? So the sort of difference in idea between looking at just the absolute number in poverty versus the share of people in poverty. Now,
absolute number of what exactly?
so absolute
Total number
of people. The total number of people versus the ratio of the number of people to the so the number of total population to the population that is poor. That would be a ratio versus the head count. So if you look at just head count, that is simply, so if over here, for example, in this group, there are 10 people who are poor. So we've got about 16 or 18 attendees right now. So the total number of people, the head count would be 10. That is an absolute number. The ratio or the share would be 10 by 18 or 10 by the total number. So that's what we're talking about between, as the difference between the two. But in both these definitions, I think what you tend to miss out is the depth of poverty, right? So how poor are the poor? How are they poor? In what areas are they poor? How does it manifest itself? So that doesn't get calculated over here. So there are a whole host of ethical and philosophical questions about poverty measurement. Whenever we're talking about a poverty measure, there are always these philosophical questions that are raised. One question was the one that was raised right now, right? How do we view poverty? How do we view people in poverty rather? So I'm not going to go into each of the ethical and philosophical questions because that can take a whole, there's a lot of time that will get lost in that. If you really want to get into it, then there are courses on YouTube which actually have details about this. But I'm going to cover just 3 very important ones which are relevant from the point of view of multidimensional poverty. So the first is the depth of poverty, right? Because headcount and share both don't give you what that poverty manifests itself as. And it also creates certain perverse incentives for the people who are helping people get out of poverty. So let's take this example over here, right? So you've got a country where the poverty line is rupees 10. There are 5 citizens only in that country. So you've got first this woman who's earning well, you've got this person who's earning 14, 7, 6 and 9 and so on, right? So when you take a head count over here, the number of people in poverty are 3. Right? So 3 out of 5 is the share of people in poverty. Now 5 years later, everything is remaining the same. The poverty line is still 10, everyone's grown at the same pace, but now you've got these people who are earning the same amount, 12, 14, you've got 8 and 7, so those two are still under poverty. You've got this person earning 9 rupees. So on the face of it, poverty hasn't reduced, right? You've still got 3 people out of 5 who are still poor. But this person, these 2 people are now earning more than they were. So on the basis of that, can you say that poverty is reduced? Should a poverty measure look at just the number of people in poverty, or should it look at the depth of their poverty? So if someone's income is increasing and they're getting closer to the basic minimum line, should that not reflect in the poverty measure coming down? So that's something that has fundamentally been a debate, and to sort of alleviate this to some degree, we've got certain methodologies that came in and certain measures that came in at a later point. And the other sort of problem that comes along with this is, if we were looking at simply a poverty line based measure, right, where you're just trying to lift people out of poverty, if I was a policy maker and if I was trying to improve my metrics, right, if I was trying to improve the number of people in poverty, who would I help out first? Would I help the most vulnerable, or would I help this person? Because if I just give him 1 rupee more, that person would, then poverty would come down, right? So that creates a perverse incentive for me, if we're not measuring intensity or depth, to just not help the most vulnerable, but instead help the person who is closest to the line, which is not an ideal outcome when you look at it from a policy point of view. So there were a couple of other measures that came in. So there was something called the Foster-Clear-Thorbecke mechanism that came in. This was back in the 80s, which looked at the spread of poverty. It looked at what is the difference between the highest earner and the lowest earner, and that was a measure of poverty also. And then there was something called the square gap method, which is nothing but a square root of this, to basically say that if you help the person who is lowest on your on the income spread, then it would have the greatest impact on your poverty line measure. So these are 2 fundamental questions, and multidimensional poverty has tried to address this. So when you look at multidimensional poverty, I don't know if all of you have sort of seen the report. We are talking about 2 measures, right? You've got the head count and you've got the intensity. So the intensity is nothing but the depth of poverty or the breadth of poverty, depending on which terminology you use, which gives you an idea of how poor are the poor and how is it manifesting themselves, and it gives you an incentive to make sure that you're not helping just the people who are absolutely on the line, and you're helping the most vulnerable. So we come to that when we discuss that in the methodology part. But for now, the other ethical question is that there are always been questions raised about poverty line, because it's very arbitrary. One, the poverty line varies significantly. So if the World Bank has gone, so the international poverty line that's been set by the World Bank is $1.90 per day. So now if the World Bank has set $1.90 per day, $1.90 will get you a lot more in a country like India, whereas $1.90 will get you nothing in, say, Europe, right? So there's a lot, and then you've got purchasing power parity, which came in to sort of address that to some degree. But there has always been a measure about question about why $1.90, right? Why can't it be more? What is the basic minimum? Because then it's a very subjective term. It's very hard to sort of address, what the basic standard of living should be. So there's always been questions raised, ethical questions raised about whether it is right to set a poverty line per se. And the third question is about the completeness of income-based poverty. Does income-based poverty reflect deprivation in general? Is a question that's always been there, right? So if I just put in money into the hands of the poor, is that enough to remove their deprivations? That's something that there has always been a question about, and some of these quandaries or these moral and ethical questions are what has led to the concept of multidimensional poverty, and even before that the concept of capability approach. So if you look at the poor, for example, right? So they generally, so this is from a study called Voices of the Poor. This was done in the early 2000s, and I can send you a link to the study. It's a very interesting study because it actually goes to the poor and asks them, how do you articulate being poor? So if you look at the way that the poor articulate poverty, it's quite interesting, and you'll see a trend that's coming up there, right? So you're talking about, if you look at this person, they're not talking about money anywhere, right? It's about security. Not in one point are you seeing money coming into the picture. If you look at this person, they're talking about food and their ability to eat 3 meals a day. Again, money is not articulated anywhere. Third, our parents did not go to school today, so we are poor today. Education can change this. So it's again not about income, it's about ability to earn or education. Fourth, I'm afraid that they might kill my son for something as irrelevant as a snack. So again, over here you're not seeing none of the traditional sort of understandings of poverty, right? You're not seeing money, you're not seeing food, you're not seeing education, you're seeing violence and security. So if you look at the poor, the way that they articulate poverty is in itself multidimensional, right? You're talking about, on the one hand, you're talking about safety and security in first and the second in very different ways. You're talking about food, you're talking about education. So it's not enough to just provide, if you give the last person just money, is that going to sort of solve that problem that they're having over there? Because we are talking about a deeper set of inequalities that actually manifest themselves in deprivations. So this is, if you look at any writing by Sabina Alkire and James Foster, the people who developed the multidimensional poverty methodology, they actually talk about this study being the normative reason that they, or the motivation that they took up the concept of trying to measure multidimensional poverty. Because, when we look at the definition that we had by the MORD, which is close to the prevailing definition of unidimensional poverty, it doesn't address any of these factors.
Do we have any labels here of anybody from India?
In this study, I don't think so. No, in this study, I don't think India was covered. But if you talk to people in the field, I mean, generally when I've gone out into the field also, and I ask them about their experience of being poor, right? Like how do they define being poor? You generally won't see financial
It's
resources.
completely different.
Yeah.
You can capture the labor fear.
Sorry.
I feel the labor fear which you have captured here, probably when you take some of the labors in our country, probably the point which you are telling, probably the first point people may talk about finance.
No, that's what I'm saying. So when I've gone into the field and when I've spoken to people, generally I've done field work in Rajasthan, done field work in Karnataka, done field work in Andhra Pradesh. Generally, financial resources is not the first thing that comes up. It comes up as a consequence. They say that, okay, we don't have education and hence we're not able to earn. Or we don't have money to buy food. Or we live in a poor locality which doesn't have access to water. So we're having to spend money on water, right? Which keeps us poor. So it's always a consequence. So generally when you speak to the poor,
I think Jean Grace did a study in Jharkhand. Jean Grace did a
Yeah.
study in Jharkhand where he notes crime and it never gets exposed.
right?
So there has been studies done in India as well.
Yeah.
He used to, Amartya Sen is also
Amartya Sen is done.
has also addressed it in a lot of papers. Not even Niti Aayog had done a primary study before coming up with their multi-dimension.
Yeah.
They had done a primary study
Yeah.
and then come.
Yeah.
So they have not directly adopted it from the West.
Yeah. There is study that's been done here. We'll come to the studies that have been done here and talk about more about the development of the concept in.
So even when we were developing the concept, I think Amartya Sen, Jean Grace, all those were involved.
In fact, Sabina Alkire herself was involved in the Indian this thing. But India has been relatively late to joining the because if you see, countries like Mexico or Chile or even Latin America, they've been using it to some degree from the early 2000s.
India had a lot of resistance to use this.
Yeah, India has had academics talking about it,
Academics
but the government has been slow.
the government had a resistance.
Yeah, and we in the second session we were talking about how India has adopted the methodology and what is the sort of impetus that has driven the process. We'll actually talk also about why India has chosen to adopt it right now, because there's a very interesting reasoning as to why that's happened. So sorry, I was saying that generally when you talk to the poor, their expression of how they are poor is very, very different. It's not usually from the financial resources point of view. Financial resources is either a factor or an outcome. So it either serves to increase or prolong their poverty or keep them in poverty, push them into poverty. So this is something that, I'm not sure what the name is, but like you were saying, the studies even in India, if you look at John Reyes, you look at Amartya Sen, if you look at Sabina Alkire, all of them have done studies which actually talk about how the expression of poor is very rarely from the financial resources point of view. So where does the motivation or the theoretical or the empirical understanding for multidimensional poverty comes from? It comes from the capability approach, which I think a lot of you are familiar with. It's something that Ed and I uses, I think. So how does Amartya Sen describe poverty? So here you see poverty being talked about very, very differently. There's no mention of financial resources at all. In fact, he openly says that it's not about money. It's about the lack of opportunity. So he believes that poverty is about, or addressing poverty is about tackling the lack of opportunity and the lack of capability or functioning, the lack of capability to achieve functioning that people have. So what is the capability approach in a nutshell? He talks about two core elements of capability, right? So you've got the functionings, which he defines as beings and doings that people value. Now, what are those beings and doings? So beings are nothing but what do people value, right? What do people want to be? So if you ask a kid, what does he want to be when he grows up? The way that he articulates is, I want to be this, right? So that is nothing but the being. So being healthy, being satisfied, being fulfilled, all of those are the beings, and the doings are what people do. So doing decent work, doing fulfilling work, all of that is the functionings. And according to the capability approach, capability is not equal to functioning. So while everyone has in theory the idea that we are able to achieve whatever we want to do, in reality social structures don't always permit you to do that. Deprivations and all of that affect the opportunity that you have to achieve your functionings, achieve what you want to do and do. So capability is the very real in the social structure. What is the real manifestation of those functionings, right? How much are you actually able to achieve is what capability is. So when Amartya Sen talks about it, he talks about it saying that poverty, addressing poverty outcomes is nothing but reducing deprivations, increasing opportunity, and by effect increasing capability. So he says poverty is not really about money at all. Poverty is about increasing the capability that people have to achieve what they want to achieve, right? So, when we look at both these slides put together, that gives us a very different view into poverty, right? So now we're moving away from income or financial resources and we're moving into concepts of multidimensional poverty. So, but why move beyond income? What are those challenges? So one thing that we've seen is that the poor who we are trying to solve for or improve the well-being of, they don't talk about poverty as being financially poor, right? So that is the normative sort of motivation. What are the data-driven motivations that urge us to look beyond income poverty? So the first thing is that growth is a necessary condition for improvement to happen, right? But growth in itself does not improve social inequalities. Because we've traditionally seen that as societies progress, the definition of poverty varies. In fact, in some countries, you've seen the spread of poverty increasing, where you're seeing that the gap between the people, the haves and the have-nots is actually just widening, right? So at the macro level, growth is not in itself linked to improvement in social inequalities. At the micro level, income is not a good proxy for deprivation. So one of the things I said earlier is that when you try to look at the overlap between the people who are deprived and between poor households, there isn't a very clear overlap. And there has been a study that was done by one of the former presidents of the UN and Sabina Al-Ghayat, where they actually tried to map the progress on the Millennium Development Goals with the growth in the economy. And they generally found that there was no pattern there, right? So just because the economy has grown or because the per capita GDP has grown, you don't see a consequent rise in achievement of social indicators. And that speaks to both of these, right? At the macro level, you're seeing that growth is not sufficient. And at the micro level, you're seeing that just by increasing income, you do not address poverty. And we come to why that is in a second. But a couple of other problems is that, in a very normative sense, if you use just monetary indicators, it doesn't explain the experience of being poor, right? And that is not a good enough way for us to be addressing poverty. If we don't understand how the poor articulate poverty, we're not going to be able to address what it means for them to be poor. For income, if you just put hands, this is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? If you just put money in the hands of people, is that enough for them to convert it into a valuable function that they desire? It's not enough, because there are a whole host of other social and socioeconomic sort of factors that could be holding them back from doing something, right? So that is where the concept of inequality and intersectionality comes in. So when you look at the UNDP-based MDP study, you'll see the majority of or the share of multidimensionally poor households is much higher in people from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe households. So the reasoning for that is very clear, right? It's because of inequality, because they're not able to. So if you just put money in the hands of those people, it doesn't change the norms of the society to enable them to actually put that money to good use, right? So that is the inequality concept, right? Because it's not just about income measures over there. It is about also how social structures translate that into actual tangible socio-economic achievement. The second is about intersectionality, right? So intersectionality is this concept in social sciences where you're basically talking about how you look at a person as an onion, right? So they have various layers to their to define themselves, right? So in a very simple way, if I was to talk about myself, right? So when someone asks me to introduce myself, I'm going to say I am Anirudh, I come from this place, I do this for a living, right? So if you look at that, it's nothing but different layers to my identity. Now, all of those layers in a social science, that is purely from an identity point of view, but from a social science point of view, all of those layers actually add on certain meanings to them, right? So if you're looking at someone who is say a woman, they face a certain set of deprivations because they're women, right? Because social structures are not aligned to, you've got patriarchal norms and so on. If you've got a woman from a scheduled caste background, they face an additional set of deprivations. If you've got a woman from an income poor household in a scheduled caste background, right? So the layers actually add on an additional set of challenges for them to surmount, and that is nothing but intersectional identities, right? So it's one thing to understand that, okay, this person is from this group and hence they are deprived. It's another thing to understand that every person, there are multiple identities that they have, and each of those identities add a certain meaning as well as maybe certain challenges. So that is intersectionality. So right, so if you take an example of a woman, right, who lives in say a rural area and doesn't have access to drinking water. Now she earns the same amount as say a woman in an urban area who has a tap water connection in their house. If you put the same amount of income into these people's hands, it doesn't translate the same way, because this woman has to go, the woman in the rural area has to go and fetch water from somewhere else, right? So that takes away time that she could be spending in say earning, or she could be spending in taking care of the household, or just sleeping, who knows, right? Or they need to alternatively be spending money on purchasing drinking water, right? So if you just put money in the hands of people, the way that it actually manifests itself, right, and whether it addresses their deprivations or not is not equal. And that's where the concept of multidimensional poverty helps to plug it in, right? Because if you're looking at just income, all you would be talking about is, okay, this person doesn't have, if we give them money, we would be able to bring them out of poverty. But now more and more we're realizing that it's not just about giving them money, it is actually about addressing these deprivations and sort of increasing their opportunity to capabilities, to livelihoods, to skills and so on, for you to actually cross that line from being poor to non-poor. So this is from the UNDP 2021 study. So if you look at the data over here, right, so the purple is people who are in severe multidimensional poverty. Sorry, blue is severe multidimensional poverty, and the purple is just people in multidimensional poverty. And these lines that you see over here, the dots, that is income poor households, right? So you're seeing that in the majority of countries over here, I think it's 43 out of 60 that we have studied, the number of multidimensionally poor people is more than the number of people who come from just income poor households. So income poor is not an effective proxy to actually capture the entirety of deprivation that people face. And there is a significant difference in the overlaps between the people who come from income poor households and the people who come from multidimensional. They're not the same people. There was a study in India that was done, which was one of the reasons why multidimensional poverty as a concept came into India, which found that 53% of the kids who are malnourished come from non-income poor households. So there isn't an overlap between, you can't clearly say that, okay, if this household is income poor, they are probably the ones who don't have access to sanitation, don't have access to nutrition, don't have access to healthcare. Because that spread is quite different. And that's why we need multidimensional poverty as a complement to income-based poverty. So what have we learned from all of this that we studied so far, right? So poverty must account for deprivations not just in income, but also deprivations in a host of other dimensions. So MPI is a complement. Even if you look at the terminology used in Niti Aayog study, they talk about MPI not as the be-all end-all tool. They're not replacing income-based poverty measurement with the MPI. They are basically talking about the MPI as a complement to the national income-based poverty measure. So it aids in better targeting of households that face deprivation. More than the income-based poverty measure, the MPI allows us to see who is poor, not just who is poor, but also how are they poor, right? Where are they poor? How are those deprivations manifesting themselves? This is something that the income-based poverty measure doesn't do. And the nice thing about the multidimensional poverty approach is that if you look at the way that the dimensions are structured, it's not uniform. We don't have one uniform measure saying that across the world we're going to be, the UNDP and the World Bank of course have their own methods on how they do it, and they do it across countries. But if you look at the way that every country has adopted it, those dimensions are aligned with the national goals that they have. So if you look at a country like Colombia, they have 6 different indicators. If you look at a country like Mexico, they have 4 indicators, which are all aligned to what their constitutional understandings are. In India, we have 3 indicators which are drawn from the UNDP measure. So we'll go into what those indicators are, but the concept of multidimensional poverty is something that can be customized based on the constitutional understanding of that country, the level of development that they're at. So it's a lot easier for you to actually tailor make that as opposed to income-based measures. So in India, the context that we use are health, education, and standard of living. This is drawn straight from the UNDP or the OFI measure, and we come to that in a minute. And the final thing that we learned is that deprivations affect the well-being and ability to achieve functioning that we're talking about, right? So if we want people to achieve functioning, we want to increase their capability, you have to address those deprivations. And more important than that, deprivations can actually intensify poverty, they can prolong poverty, so they can keep people poor, they can even pull people into poverty. And we've seen COVID, which is a great example of that, right? Where you've got decades of progress, like about 30-40 years of progress, just sort of sat down because access to health is poor. And how does that happen? The example of the woman who has to go and fetch water, that gives you a good example of that, right? So it intensifies her poverty because she's not able to say, use that time to earn. Or if you look at the example, another usual classic example that's given is that of a laborer, right? So you can't just, so a laborer as compared to someone who works a sedentary job has a higher calorie requirement, right? So if you're not meeting that calorie requirement, malnourishment occurs, affects their ability to work, falls ill more, intensifies poverty. So deprivations can in and of themselves cause, prolong and intensify poverty. So how did the NPP come up in the global context, right? So you've got the NPP was being used in some countries, in some Latin American countries as early as the 1990s. They had some crude measures of the NPP. At the global level, you had the Human Poverty Index, which was used for the first time by the UNDP in their Human Development Report, which tried to do that. But that was a very crude measure. It was something that wasn't very accepted when it came out. In 2010, OFI, which is the Poverty and Human Development Institute at the University of Oxford, launched the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, and the people who came up with that methodology are the people who you see in the photos over there, right? So you've got Sabina Alcair and James Foster, and the methodology that's used to calculate it is called the Alcair-Foster methodology. And that was launched in 2010. In the 2010 Human Development Report, for the first time we saw the global MPI measure, and then now that has become its own. You can see the World Bank using the same methodology, you can see the UNDP using the methodology, and they come out with their own reports. It's no longer just a part of the Human Development Report, it's actually a report in itself. And a lot of countries now are using the MPI. India is one example, Mexico has it, Colombia has it. In fact, there's a group of countries that's been brought together by the OFI. It's called the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network. That includes India, so there are 30 developing countries that are part of it, and I think now the number is risen to 25, and the membership is constantly increasing. Who are using multidimensional poverty, who are contributing to the methodology and the research behind it, and trying to define the process as we go along. And there are also some modifications, very interesting modifications of the Alkire-Foster methodology, because it's now no longer used only for multidimensional poverty. It's also being used for certain other calculations. So if any of you heard of the happiness index, Bhutan's gross national happiness index, and we've got a happiness index in India also, that uses the same Alkire-Foster method. And the Alkire-Foster method is useful in a bunch of contexts, and we'll get to that when we do the second session. What about the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Where does multidimensional poverty feature there? So if you saw the Millennium Development Goals, which were active till 2015 before the SDGs, you had goal number 1, which was talking about eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. And if you look at the definitions over here, or the targets that are set over here, these are very different from what are there in the SDGs right now, right? So at that point it was $1.25, now it's $1.90. So they said that we were going to halve the population of the proportion of people whose daily income is less than that. We're going to achieve full and productive employment, and we're going to halve the proportion of individuals suffering from hunger. So you are seeing some sort of element of multidimensionality there, because you've got income-based poverty and you've got employment and you've got health and the rest, but it's not really there. It's not there in as many words. If you look at the SDGs though, they talk about it in a very different way, right? So they're talking about eradicating extreme poverty for all people everywhere. So you've got income-based poverty, and the second one, target 1, actually talks about poverty purely in the multidimensional sense, right? Where it says reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions. And this is where the, according to national definitions part comes in, because in practice the multidimensional poverty measure can be adopted by countries based on their own priorities, right? So if you look at the movement from the MDGs to the SDGs, this sort of captures the global shift from using income as a sole proxy for poverty to multidimensional poverty. So we can take a 5-minute break now, and then we can get into the next session, which is on how we calculate it. Great.